On a night when the winter forest lay strangled beneath ice and wind, 3 frozen German shepherds emerged from the white like ghosts that refused to fade. Their ribs pressed hard against their skin, breath tearing from their chests in thin, desperate clouds. One limped badly, another stood guard. The third leaned in close, as if holding the others upright by will alone. They did not bark. They did not snarl. They simply waited at the edge of a lonely cabin, bodies shaking, eyes fixed on the door, asking for mercy without a sound. Inside that cabin lived a reclusive, war-scarred veteran, a man who had built his life in the woods to keep the world and its violence far away. When he opened the door, instinct told him to brace for danger. But what he saw shattered that reflex. He saw loyalty stronger than fear. He saw soldiers who refused to abandon their wounded, and in their trembling standoff against death, he recognized a reflection of the battles he still fought in silence. He stepped aside and let them in, unaware that this single choice would soon entangle him with a hunted policewoman, awaken wounds he had buried for years, and forge a family where none should have existed. What happens next will break something open inside you, then quietly show you how healing begins. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. The blizzard tore through the northern Montana forest like a living thing, snapping branches, erasing trails, and swallowing sound beneath layers of white and wind. Ethan Miller had learned long ago how to read storms the way other men read faces. The pitch of the wind, the pressure in his ears, the way silence arrived in fragments, then vanished. At 43, Ethan lived alone in a weather-beaten log cabin tucked deep among the pines, far from towns, roads, and the kinds of people who still asked questions he didn't want to answer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a body shaped by years of military service rather than comfort. His face carried sharp angles, softened by time-high cheekbones, a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, and a beard he kept trimmed but never clean-shaven, streaked with premature gray. His hair, once dark brown, had thinned at the temples and was usually hidden beneath a wool cap pulled low. His eyes were the most telling feature, a flat, watchful blue that missed little and trusted even less. Ethan was a combat veteran, discharged years earlier after an incident overseas that never made the news and never left his mind. He didn't talk about it, not to strangers, not to himself. The event had carved something out of him, his tolerance for crowds, his patience for noise, his belief that danger announced itself clearly. Out here in the woods, life was simple, chopping wood, melting snow, fixing what broke. Nights passed with the crackle of fire and the quiet weight of memory. That was enough. On this night, he had already secured the shutters, stacked the last of the firewood inside, and poured himself a mug of black coffee that tasted faintly of ash. The cabin groaned as wind pressed against it, snow hissing across the logs like sandpaper. Ethan sat at the small pine table, sharpening a knife more out of habit than need, when the sound came. Not loud, not sudden. A scraping, followed by something softer. He froze. Another scrape, then a faint, uneven breath. His hand tightened around the knife handle as old instincts flared awake, fast and cold. Nothing came to his door in weather like this unless it was desperate or dangerous. He rose slowly, boots silent against the worn floorboards, and moved toward the front window. With 2 fingers, he lifted the edge of the curtain. At first, he thought the storm was playing tricks on him. Shapes shifted constantly in the blowing snow, but then one shape stepped forward into the thin glow cast by the porch light. Then another. Then a third. 3 German shepherds stood at the edge of his porch. They were large dogs, even by the breed standards, but starvation had carved them down to something almost skeletal. Their coats, once thick and proud, were stiff with ice, clumped with snow and dirt. The closest dog a male, judging by the build, held himself stiffly, his ears upright despite the wind, his dark muzzle marked by an old pale scar that pulled slightly at one side of his mouth. His eyes were amber, sharp, and locked onto the door with a focus Ethan recognized too well. The second dog, slightly smaller, favored her right hind leg, barely putting weight on it as she shifted. Her breathing was shallow, controlled through pain. The third was younger, perhaps 2 years old, lean and narrow-faced, his ribs clearly visible beneath his fur. He pressed close to the others as if proximity alone kept him standing. They didn't bark. They didn't growl. They simply stood there, shaking not with aggression, but with cold and exhaustion, staring at the cabin like men who had reached the last outpost before the end of the map. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears. German shepherds meant training, discipline, purpose. These were not feral animals. These were working dogs, or had been. His mind cataloged details automatically: posture, spacing, the way the scarred male positioned himself half a step ahead of the others, subtly blocking them. Guard behavior, unit behavior. A memory flickered: boots crunching on gravel, a handler's whistle, dogs moving in precise arcs under floodlights. The younger dog swayed. His front legs buckled just slightly before he caught himself. Snow clung to his eyelashes. He lowered his head, not in submission, but in surrender. Something tightened painfully in Ethan's chest. He glanced at the door, then back at the dogs. The logical part of him listed risks: unknown animals, disease, violence. Once you open a door, you don't control what comes through it. He had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, under a different sky, with different screams. Another gust slammed into the cabin, rattling the frame. The injured female let out a soft, involuntary whine, more breath than sound. The scarred male shifted closer to her, his body angling to shield her from the wind, even as ice collected along his spine. That did it. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He set the knife down on the table, its edge catching the firelight, and crossed the room. At the door he paused, hand resting on the latch. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older than he felt, harder than he wanted to be. "Don't make me regret this," he muttered, unsure whether he was speaking to himself or the storm. He opened the door. Warm air rushed out, replaced instantly by the knife-edged cold. Snow blew across the threshold. The dogs didn't surge forward. They didn't hesitate either. The scarred male stepped in first, paws landing carefully on the wooden floor, muscles taut as cables. He stopped just inside, head low, eyes scanning. The injured female followed, moving slowly, her limp more pronounced in the light. The younger dog came last, pausing at the doorway as if expecting to be turned away, then slipping inside when nothing stopped him. Ethan closed the door behind them, the click of the latch echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. For a moment, none of them moved. Fire popped in the hearth. The dogs' breaths fogged the air. Ethan stood with his back to the door, hands loose at his sides, heart pounding with the awareness that he had just invited 3 unknown variables into the one place he had sworn to keep safe. The scarred male met his gaze. No challenge, no fear, just a steady, measuring look that carried something like recognition. Ethan swallowed. He had the strangest thought then that these dogs had not come here by accident, that the storm had driven them, yes, but something else had guided them to this exact door, this exact man who understood what it meant to be wounded and still standing. "All right," he said quietly, voice rough from disuse. "You're in." He moved first to the fire, feeding another log into the flames until the heat swelled. Then he fetched an old blanket from the footlocker beneath his bed and laid it near the hearth. The dogs watched every movement, alert but not reactive. When the injured female finally eased herself down onto the blanket, a shudder ran through her body as warmth seeped into bone. The younger dog collapsed beside her, resting his head against her flank with a soft, exhausted huff. The scarred male remained standing, though his legs trembled. Only when Ethan took a deliberate step back did he lie down as well, positioning himself between the others and the room. Ethan went to the small pantry and pulled out what little fresh meat he had planned to ration for the next few days. He hesitated, then cut it into portions and placed them on a plate, setting it on the floor a few feet away before retreating. The dogs waited. A full 3 seconds passed. Then the injured female moved first, sniffing, taking one careful bite. The others followed, eating quickly but without frenzy. Ethan watched them, something inside him cracking open with quiet inevitability. He had meant to live alone. He had built his life around that choice. Yet here, in the heart of a storm, 3 battered souls had crossed his threshold, and the silence he had clung to for years no longer felt like peace. It felt like something unfinished. As the wind howled outside and the fire burned steady, Ethan Miller sat down in his chair and realized, with a mixture of dread and reluctant hope, that this night was not an interruption. It was the beginning of exactly what the storm had brought to his door. Ethan Miller locked the door with deliberate care, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place as if the forest itself might try to follow the dogs inside. The sound echoed through the cabin, final and grounding, and only then did he allow himself to breathe fully. The storm pressed against the walls, but the space between the logs held, trapping warmth, light, and now 4 living beings who had not planned on sharing the same shelter when the night began. The dogs spread out slowly, each movement cautious, measured. They did not rush the fire or the food. That restraint confirmed what Ethan already suspected. These animals had been trained to obey, to assess, to wait. They were not wild. They were disciplined, and discipline like that did not come from kindness alone. It came from structure, commands repeated until they fused with instinct, and from handlers who expected obedience even under stress. Ethan studied them from the corner of his eye, careful not to stare. Years in combat had taught him that direct attention could be interpreted as a challenge. The scarred male, clearly the leader, claimed the space closest to the room's center, positioning his body so he could see both the door and Ethan at once. His coat was a dark sable, thick beneath the ice, and his age showed in the faint cloudiness at the edges of his eyes. Ethan estimated 5, maybe 6 years old, prime working age. The scar along his muzzle was clean, pale, and old, no recent trauma. That mark had come from a past mission or a fight that mattered. The injured female lay closer to the fire now, her breathing steadier, though her hind leg twitched intermittently. She had a softer coat, black and tan, with a narrow face and intelligent dark eyes that tracked Ethan whenever he moved. She was smaller than the male but carried herself with quiet authority. Pain had not dulled her awareness. If anything, it had sharpened it. She was likely 4, Ethan thought, old enough to be seasoned, young enough to still push herself past reason. The youngest dog hovered between them, never straying far from either. His coat was lighter, more tan than black. His ears still slightly oversized for his head, a telltale sign of youth. He was barely holding himself together, muscles trembling as exhaustion finally overpowered adrenaline. When he curled up and rested his head against the injured female's side, Ethan felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with fear. He went to the sink and poured water into a metal bowl, setting it down carefully. The dogs waited until he stepped away. Only then did the scarred male drink, taking short pulls, lifting his head between each one as if expecting interruption. The others followed. Controlled. Efficient. Military habits, Ethan thought grimly. You don't forget those easily. He sat down slowly in his chair, the old one with the cracked leather armrests, and let the silence stretch. The fire popped. Wind screamed down the chimney. Outside, the world remained hostile and vast, but inside the cabin, time seemed to slow, thickening like sap. 9s, he thought again, not just trained dogs. These had worked with law enforcement or military units. The harness marks were still faintly visible beneath their fur, rubbed raw by straps worn too long. That meant handlers. A unit. A reason they had been out here. Something had gone wrong. Ethan rose again and fetched his first aid kit, setting it on the table without opening it yet. The injured female noticed immediately. Her body stiffened. The scarred male stood, stepping forward, placing himself between Ethan and her, his hackles lifting just enough to send a message. Not aggression. Warning. "It's all right," Ethan said quietly. His voice was low, steady, carrying the same tone he had used years ago to calm terrified recruits pinned down under fire. "I'm not here to hurt her." The dog didn't move. Ethan stopped where he was. He crouched slowly, lowering himself until he was no longer looming. He turned his body slightly sideways, a non-threatening posture, and waited. Minutes passed. His knees began to ache, but he didn't shift. Finally, the scarred male eased back half a step. Not permission, but tolerance. Ethan opened the kit and moved slowly, deliberately. He did not reach for the dog. He let her see everything first. Gauze, antiseptic, bandage wrap. The smell of alcohol hit the air, sharp and clean. The injured female's ears flattened briefly, then lifted again. She did not retreat. When Ethan approached her leg, she flinched but did not snap. Her breath hitched as he examined the injury. The swelling was obvious now that the ice had melted away. The wound wasn't fresh, at least a day old, maybe more. The skin was cracked, raw, likely frostbite compounded by strain. She had been walking on it far longer than she should have. "Damn," Ethan muttered under his breath. He cleaned it gently, hands steady, movements efficient. His touch was firm but careful, the way medics had once treated him in field tents under worse conditions. The female whimpered once, low and soft, then rested her head on the floor as if accepting the pain as a necessary cost. The scarred male hovered inches away, eyes never leaving Ethan's hands. When the bandage was finally secured, Ethan leaned back, letting out a slow breath. The female tested the leg, then settled again. The youngest dog crept closer, nosing the wrap, licking it once before curling beside her. The Ethan closed the kit and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping up on him now that the immediate tension had passed. His mind raced despite his body's demand for rest. 3 K9s didn't simply disappear into the woods without reason, and they didn't walk miles through a blizzard unless the alternative was worse. That was when he heard it. A sound beneath the wind. Subtle. Wrong. Ethan's head snapped up. The dogs reacted instantly. The scarred male turned toward the door, body rigid. The youngest dog rose unsteadily, ears swiveling. The injured female did not stand, but her eyes sharpened, locking onto the same point. Footsteps. Outside. Measured. Careful. Too deliberate to belong to an animal. Ethan stood, muscles coiling as memory surged. Check angles, control breathing, assess exits. He moved to the window and lifted the curtain just enough to see through the frost-smeared glass. At first there was nothing. Then a shape detached itself from the tree line, human. Hooded, moving low, favoring cover. Ethan's jaw tightened. He reached for the rifle mounted above the door but stopped himself short. Not yet. The dogs watched him, reading his tension with uncanny precision. The scarred male let out a low, warning rumble, not loud enough to alert whoever was outside, but enough to confirm Ethan wasn't imagining things. Whoever it was paused near the edge of the clearing. Snow swirled around them, obscuring details. Then a gloved hand lifted slightly, as if signaling surrender or asking for patience. Ethan cracked the door open just an inch, cold slicing through the gap. "Don't come any closer," he called out, voice carrying through the storm. The figure froze. A woman's voice answered, strained but controlled. "I'm not here to hurt you, or them." That stopped him. She stepped forward into the porch light, pushing back her hood. She was in her early 30s, average height, lean from endurance rather than frailty. Her hair was dark blonde, pulled back into a low, practical knot, strands stiff with ice. Her face was pale, skin chapped raw by wind, with sharp cheekbones and tired gray eyes that missed nothing. A thin cut marked her left brow, hastily cleaned but not treated properly. She wore a heavy police parka, the word sheriff barely visible beneath snow and grime. Her posture told Ethan more than her words. She stood square, hands visible, shoulders tense but controlled. This was someone trained to de-escalate, to survive, someone who had learned the hard way not to trust easily. "I'm Emily Carter," she said, "police officer, and those dogs?" Her gaze flicked past Ethan just briefly. "They're why I'm here." Ethan didn't lower his guard. He studied her face, the way her eyes lingered on the dogs with something close to relief and guilt. "You followed them," he said. "Yes," she replied, "and someone else might be following me." The storm howled, swallowing the rest of her words, but Ethan had heard enough. He looked back at the dogs, at the injured female resting her head against the floor, at the scarred male standing ready to defend, and at the youngest one watching the woman with cautious recognition. This night was unfolding exactly as he had feared, and exactly as it needed to. He opened the door wider. "Get inside, before the storm makes the decision for all of us." Emily hesitated only a second before stepping over the threshold, snow melting from her boots onto the wooden floor. The door closed behind her, sealing them all together in the small cabin as the storm raged on, indifferent to the fragile alliances being forged within. The fire burned steadier now, no longer fighting the cold but holding its ground against it, and Ethan Miller moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent too many nights keeping something alive under worse conditions. He divided the remaining food into careful portions, not generous, not stingy balance the way rations had always been balanced when tomorrow was uncertain. Emily Carter watched from the far side of the cabin, her back against the wall, shoulders tense beneath her snow-crusted parka. Up close, she looked more worn than dangerous. The wind had stripped the softness from her face, leaving her skin pale and tight, her lips cracked, her hands raw despite thick gloves. She was average height, perhaps 5'6", lean without being fragile, the kind of build that came from long shifts, bad sleep, and a career that punished hesitation. Her eyes, a cool gray blue, tracked Ethan constantly, not with suspicion alone, but with something heavier calculation layered over fatigue. She removed her hood slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile ceasefire existed in the room. Her hair, darker blonde than it had looked outside, was pulled back into a functional knot at the nape of her neck, a few loose strands clinging to her temples. A thin bruise darkened the side of her jaw, old enough to be turning yellow at the edges. Someone had struck her recently, and she had not had the luxury of stopping for it. The dogs reacted to her presence in stages. The youngest one stared openly, nostrils flaring as he tested her scent, then tilted his head slightly, uncertain. The injured female watched without moving, eyes alert but not alarmed. The scarred male never took his eyes off Emily, his body angled subtly toward her, muscles taut beneath his damp coat. He didn't advance. He didn't retreat. He stood guard, the way Ethan himself once had stood, between danger and men who couldn't move fast enough. Emily noticed. Her gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan. "He's the leader," she said quietly. Her voice was low, controlled, carrying the faint rasp of someone who had spent hours breathing frozen air. "Always has been." Ethan nodded once. "You know them?" "Yes." Emily exhaled, the sound more like relief than confirmation. Their handler was Officer Mark Reyes. The name landed heavily. Ethan didn't know the man, but he knew the tone. Loss lived there. Emily's eyes dropped briefly to the injured female, softening. "That one's called June. She's stubborn, too brave for her own good." She gestured subtly toward the youngest dog. "That's Cole. Barely finished certification. Still thinks every problem can be solved by staying close enough." Her gaze returned to the scarred male. "And that's Ranger. He never leaves anyone behind." Ranger. The name fit. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest as he looked at them again. No longer nameless figures pulled from the storm, but individuals with history, purpose, and someone who had once given them commands and praise. "What happened to Reyes?" he asked. Emily hesitated. That told him enough, but she answered anyway. "He's dead." The word sat between them, heavy and unadorned. Ranger let out a low sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something closer to breath pushed through memory. June shifted, pressing her head more firmly against the floor. Cole moved closer to her without thinking. Emily swallowed. 3 nights ago, a call came in about a remote property near the state line, possible illegal trafficking operation. Reyes and I responded with the K9 unit. It was supposed to be routine. Ethan had heard that word before. It never meant what people thought it meant. She continued, voice steady now, professional instinct overriding grief. It wasn't routine. There were armed men. More than we expected. The storm hit early, cut off radio, shots were fired. Reyes went down trying to get June out of the line of fire. Her hand clenched unconsciously at her side. He ordered me to run. Told me to take the dogs and get help. I didn't make it far before. She touched the bruise on her jaw. Someone wanted to make sure none of us did. Ethan listened without interruption. He recognized the rhythm of the story. Chaos, loss, the moment where training collided with instinct and instinct won. You think they followed you? Emily nodded. I know they did. I lost them once in the trees. Thought I'd shaken them. Then the dogs bolted, straight into the storm. I followed their tracks as long as I could. And you found my cabin, Ethan said. They did, Emily corrected quietly. I just caught up. Silence filled the space again, heavier now, but clearer. Outside the wind screamed past the logs, but inside something settled. Years of habit dictated his movements. He didn't fight them. Ranger finally shifted, lowering himself into a sit, though his eyes never left Emily. It was not acceptance, it was acknowledgement. Emily noticed and nodded faintly, as if responding to a salute. Ethan crouched again near June, checking the bandage. The swelling hadn't worsened. That was good. He reached for a second blanket and laid it near her, close enough that she could feel the heat, but not so close that she'd overheat. June watched his hands, then rested her chin on the edge of the fabric, breathing slowly. Trust, given inch by inch. I didn't plan on dragging you into this, Emily said after a while. There was no apology in her voice, just honesty. You live out here for a reason. I can see that. Ethan's mouth twitched slightly. I didn't plan on opening the door. No, she agreed, but you did. He glanced at her, really looked at her now, not as a threat or a complication, but as a woman standing on the edge of exhaustion, carrying responsibility that wasn't hers alone anymore. You said someone wanted to make sure none of you made it out, he said. That means they know the dogs are witnesses. Yes. And they know you're alive. Emily met his gaze. Yes. Ranger rose suddenly, head snapping toward the window. His ears flattened, his body going rigid. Cole followed a second later, scrambling to his feet despite fatigue. June didn't stand, but her eyes sharpened, tracking the same direction. Ethan was already moving. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and peered through the narrow side window. Snow swirled thickly, obscuring most of the clearing, but something darker moved between the trees, too slow for an animal, too deliberate. A flash of metal caught what little light existed. Ethan's jaw set. He reached up and unhooked the rifle from its mount, checking the chamber with practiced ease. He didn't raise it yet. He didn't need to. Emily stepped beside him, her posture shifting subtly, shoulders squaring, fear replaced by focus. She drew her sidearm, movements fluid despite the cold. Her hands were steady. Whatever she'd seen in the past few days, it hadn't broken her. They're closer than before, she murmured. Storms covering their approach, Ethan replied. Sound carries wrong in weather like this. Ranger let out a low, warning rumble again, deeper now, vibrating through the cabin floor. It wasn't fear. It was readiness. Ethan felt it, the old familiar clarity slipping into place. The narrowing of the world to angles and options. He didn't welcome it, but he trusted it. We don't run, he said quietly. Not with June injured. Emily nodded. I wasn't planning to. They exchanged a look then, brief but complete. An understanding forged not by trust but by necessity. 2 people shaped by different uniforms, standing on the same line. Ethan moved to the back of the cabin, checking the secondary exit, then returned, lowering his voice. If they come in, Ranger goes first, he said, not questioning whether Emily would understand. She did. He always does, she replied. The wind howled louder, as if protesting what was about to happen. Snow slammed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Outside, a shadow paused at the edge of the clearing, then shifted closer. Inside, 3 dogs stood ready, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the door. A veteran tightened his grip on a rifle he had hoped never to use again. A police officer steadied her breath, refusing to break. The storm had brought them together. Now it was testing what they would do to protect one another. The forest did not announce danger with sound. It announced it with absence. The wind that had howled all night faltered, then thinned, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan Miller felt it before he saw it. The old tightening behind his ribs, the sharpened focus that had once kept him alive in places where hesitation killed faster than bullets. Ranger's low rumble deepened, vibrating through the floorboards like a warning drum, and Cole's ears snapped forward, every muscle coiling despite exhaustion. June shifted on her blanket, pain flashing briefly across her eyes before discipline forced it down. Ethan lifted a finger, signaling stillness. He did not speak. Words carried poorly in snow, but movement carried worse. He moved to the window nearest the tree line, careful to keep his silhouette broken by the log frame. Outside, dawn smeared gray-blue across the sky, light just strong enough to betray motion. Between the pines, a shape detached itself from shadow, then another human outlines, hunched, deliberate, using the storm's debris and uneven ground for cover. Not locals. Locals moved differently, noisier, trusting the woods they'd grown up in. These figures treated the forest like hostile territory. Emily Carter stepped beside him without asking, her presence precise and grounded. Up close, the lines of fatigue at the corners of her eyes had deepened, but there was a steadiness there too, a professional calm honed by nights that never ended on schedule. She checked the window's reflection, not the clearing trained to read glass, to catch movement without exposing herself. Her parka was unzipped now, revealing a Kevlar vest beneath, scuffed and salt-stained. She adjusted her grip on the pistol, finger indexed, breath even. "They're splitting," she murmured. "2 left, 1 circling." Ethan nodded. "They're testing." Ranger rose, stepping forward with silent authority. He placed himself between June and the door, body angled toward the left window. His coat had dried near the fire, revealing a powerful frame, shoulders thick with muscle earned through work rather than breeding alone. The scar on his muzzle pulled slightly when his lips lifted just enough to expose teeth and unspoken promise. Cole crept closer to June, pressing his side against hers as if lending strength. His youth showed in the tremor that rippled through him, but he did not retreat. Ethan slid the rifle's sling over his shoulder and crouched, scanning the floor for angles. He knew this cabin as well as he knew his own scars. The knot in the floorboard that creaked if stepped on wrong, the window latch that stuck in cold, the back door whose hinge sang if opened too fast. He gestured toward the rear. Emily nodded and shifted, ghosting toward cover with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to move without announcing intent. A crunch sounded outside, deliberate, measured. The door rattled, not a knock, not a kick, a test. Ethan felt memory surge metal doors in foreign places, men trying handles with gloved hands, waiting for panic. He swallowed the taste of old smoke and focused. He moved to the side of the door, not in front of it, rifle lowered but ready. Ranger's ears flattened. The dog did not bark. He waited. A voice came through the wood, muffled by snow and distance. "We know you're inside." It was a man's voice, late 30s or early 40s, calm to the point of arrogance, someone used to being obeyed, someone who mistook silence for weakness. Emily's jaw tightened. Ethan raised his hand, stopping her before she could answer. He waited. Silence unsettled men like this more than words. "We don't want trouble," the voice continued. "Just the officer, and the dogs." Ranger's rumble sharpened. Cole stiffened. June lifted her head, eyes blazing. Ethan finally spoke. "You've got the wrong cabin." A pause. Snow hissed against the logs. Then footsteps shifted, closer now, confidence edging in. "Funny, the man said. "We followed the tracks." Ethan met Emily's eyes. Tracks. He cursed silently. In weather like this, even careful movement left ghosts behind. "You're trespassing," Ethan said evenly. "So are you," the voice replied, amused. "Living this far out, off-grid, no one to hear." That did it. Ethan's mouth hardened. He knew this type: men who believed isolation made victims, men who counted on fear. Ranger moved first. Not a lunge, not a charge. He placed his body against the door and released a single, deep, bark-short, controlled, unmistakable. A working dog's warning, not an animal's threat. Outside, someone swore. The circling figure revealed himself briefly between the trees. A tall man with a heavy build, shoulders hunched beneath a dark jacket, beard thick and unkempt, the kind that hid a jawline grown blunt by years of bad choices. He carried a rifle low, comfortable with its weight. His eyes flicked toward the sound, calculating. Ethan caught a glimpse of another man behind him. Leaner, sharper features, hair cut too neat for the wilderness, eyes darting constantly. The second man looked nervous. New to this, or new to killing? Emily leaned in. "The big one's name is Grant Holloway," she whispered. "Runs logistics for the operation we hit. Former security contractor. Fired for excessive force. The other—" she squinted. "That's Luke Mercer. Driver. Not a shooter unless cornered." Ethan filed the names away. Holloway moved like a man who had been given permission to hurt. Mercer moved like one who needed it. The door rattled again, harder this time. "Last chance," Holloway called. "Hand her over. We walk away." Ethan's answer was simple. He flicked the safety off. The click was quiet, but in the hush before dawn, it sounded like a verdict. Ranger exploded into motion. He did not go through the door. He went through the side window. Glass shattered outward as Ranger launched himself with terrifying precision, body a black and tan missile cutting through cold air. The crash stunned Holloway just long enough for Ethan to swing the door open and step into the storm, rifle shouldered, stance wide. Emily followed, covering his flank. Ranger hit Holloway square in the chest, driving him back into the snow. The man shouted, weapon flying from his hands as he struggled beneath the dog's weight. Ranger did not bite immediately. He pinned, controlled, training overriding rage. Mercer bolted. Emily fired once, not at Mercer, but into the snow near his feet. The crack echoed, sharp and final. Mercer skidded to a stop, hands flying up, panic breaking through bravado. Ethan advanced 2 steps, rifle steady. "On your knees." Mercer complied, breath hitching. His face was young up close, maybe 25, skin pale beneath the stubble, eyes wide and wet. Not a killer yet, Ethan thought. Not if he didn't have to be. Holloway thrashed beneath Ranger, cursing, trying to reach a knife strapped to his thigh. Ranger's teeth flashed then, sinking into fabric and muscle just enough to end the attempt. Holloway screamed, pain shredding his composure. "Call him off!" Holloway yelled. Emily didn't look at Ethan. She looked at Ranger. "Ranger," she said calmly. "Hold." The dog froze, muscles trembling, jaws locked, but pressure controlled. A perfect balance between obedience and force. Ethan felt a surge of something like awe. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, far but approaching. Emily's shoulders sagged a fraction. She'd triggered the beacon before entering the cabin, he realized. Smart, patient. She'd been buying time all along. Ethan cuffed Holloway with zip ties from his pack, securing the knife and retrieving the dropped rifle. He kicked it away. Emily moved to Mercer, securing him quickly, efficiently, without cruelty. The forest exhaled as the immediate danger passed. Snow drifted down, soft and innocent again, erasing footprints, swallowing evidence. Ranger released Holloway and returned to June without instruction, lowering himself beside her, breath coming hard. Cole nosed his shoulder, whining softly. June licked Ranger's ear once, a small, fierce gesture of gratitude. Emily watched the dogs, emotion flickering across her face before discipline smoothed it away. She turned to Ethan. "You didn't have to do that." Ethan met her gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." Red and blue lights filtered through the trees minutes later, reflecting off ice and bark. Deputies moved in, securing the men, radios crackling. Questions would come, reports, statements. But for now, the storm had lost. Ethan led Ranger back inside, tending to a shallow cut on his shoulder, murmuring praise in a low voice the dog understood. Outside, Holloway and Mercer were loaded into vehicles, their shadows swallowed by flashing lights and falling snow. When the door closed again, the cabin felt different. Not invaded. Shared. Ethan sat down heavily, exhaustion finally claiming him. Emily leaned against the table, eyes closed briefly, then opened them, meeting his. "They're safe," she said. "For now." Ethan nodded, looking at the 3 dogs by the fire. "So are we." Morning did not arrive so much as it bled into the forest, a thin, colorless light seeping through branches heavy with ice. The deputies were gone, the sirens faded into memory, and the clearing around Ethan Miller's cabin looked almost peaceful again, if one ignored the broken glass crusted into the snow and the faint tracks already being erased by falling flakes. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke, wet wool, and antiseptic. Ranger lay near the hearth, head high despite fatigue, his shoulder cleaned and wrapped with a strip torn from an old flannel shirt. June slept fitfully, breath shallow but steady, her bandaged leg elevated on folded blankets. Cole hovered between them, eyes darting at every sound, youth and loyalty tangled together. Emily Carter sat at the small pine table, hands wrapped around a mug she had not yet lifted. In the softer light, her face looked younger and more tired at once. The bruise along her jaw had darkened, a storm-colored crescent against pale skin. She had washed the blood from her hair, revealing a sandy blonde shade streaked darker at the roots, cropped practical around the ears where a helmet or hood would rub. She was not beautiful in the polished sense. Her features were sharp, purposeful nose straight, mouth firm, eyes steady. She carried herself with the posture of someone who expected to be judged by results, not appearances. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms folded, the old rifle resting within reach. He watched the dogs as much as he watched her. Silence stretched until Emily finally exhaled and spoke, her voice quieter than before, as if the truth itself demanded restraint. "There's more you need to know," she said. Ethan nodded once. "I figured." Emily took a sip of coffee, grimaced at its bitterness, and set the mug down untouched. The operation Reyes and I stumbled into wasn't just trafficking. It was storage, movement, winter routes that don't exist on maps because no one sane uses them. The kind of routes you only run when you don't want to be seen. She paused, eyes flicking to Ranger, then back to Ethan. The dogs found something during the search. Hidden compartments, cold-buried caches. Enough evidence to bury several people who wear clean suits in warm offices. Ethan felt the old, familiar chill crawl along his spine, the one that came when small violence pointed to larger machinery. And the storm. "They used it," Emily said. "Planned for it. The blizzard wasn't an accident, it was cover. When things went bad, they cut power to a repeater station we rely on. Radios went dead. GPS drifted. Reyes realized too late we weren't supposed to leave that site alive." Her jaw tightened, but she did not look away. "He shoved June toward me and told me to run. Ranger refused to move until Cole was clear. That hesitation saved Cole. It cost Reyes." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his name, ears twitching, eyes searching Emily's face. She reached out without thinking, resting her fingers briefly against his fur. He accepted the touch, a quiet acknowledgement that cut deeper than words. "They chased us," she continued. "Not all at once. Enough pressure to keep us moving, to make mistakes. The dogs scattered when the storm turned feral. I lost them in whiteout. By the time I found tracks again, they led here." She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the stacked wood, the careful order of a life built for endurance. "You were never the target, Ethan. You were collateral." Ethan absorbed that without reaction. Collateral was a language he understood. "If we stay," he said, "they'll try again." "Yes." "And if we run?" Emily hesitated. "June can't move far. Not yet. And the route's out." She shook her head. "They're compromised." Ethan glanced at June, at the rise and fall of her chest. He felt the weight of decision settle in his bones. Staying meant drawing danger back to his door. Leaving meant carrying danger through a forest that punished weakness. He'd chosen the woods years ago because they asked little of him beyond respect. Today, they demanded more. A knock sounded soft, deliberate at the back door. Ranger rose instantly, but did not bark. Ethan raised a hand. "Stay." The dog froze, coiled and ready. Ethan moved to the door, opened it a crack. A man stood there, framed by gray light and drifting snow. He was older than Emily, late 50s maybe, tall and spare, his posture straight in a way that spoke of habit rather than pride. His hair was iron gray, cut short, his beard trimmed close. Deep lines etched his face, not from age alone, but from years of squinting into weather and trouble. He wore a deputy's coat, heavy with patches, the name Caleb Turner stitched above the pocket. His eyes were a weathered hazel, steady and assessing. "Mind if I come in?" Turner asked. His voice was calm, carrying authority without swagger. Ethan studied him a beat, then opened the door. Turner stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots with practiced care. He nodded to Emily. "Officer Carter." "Deputy Turner," she replied, relief flickering and then settling into composure. Turner's gaze moved to the dogs. He softened there just a fraction. "Heard about Reyes," he said quietly. "Good man." Emily nodded. Turner turned to Ethan. "I won't pretend this won't bring heat. What you stopped last night matters, but it also rattles cages." Ethan met his gaze. "I didn't ask for it." "I know," Turner said, "which is why I'm here before the paperwork. There's a temporary facility 2 hours south, secure, warm, vets on call. If June can be transported, that's your safest play." Emily frowned. "The roads?" "Cleared enough," Turner said. "For now." He looked at Ethan. "Your cabin's known now. Even if we put eyes on it, you'll never sleep the same." Ethan thought of the nights he'd built here, the careful solitude, the quiet that had kept him breathing. He thought of Ranger breaking glass, of Cole shaking but standing, of June enduring pain without complaint. "I'll help move them," he said. Turner inclined his head. "I hoped you'd say that." Preparations moved quickly. Emily radioed for a transport crate and a veterinary unit. Turner coordinated a staggered departure, unmarked vehicles, minimal chatter. Ethan packed essentials medical kit, food, blankets, hands steady, mind clear. He moved like a man who had finally accepted a mission after years of avoiding one. As they loaded June carefully onto a sled lined with padding, Cole pressed close, whining softly. Ranger hovered, eyes sharp, body between June and the world. Ethan knelt beside him. "We get her through this," he said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once, controlled and certain. Snow began to fall harder as they stepped outside. The forest watched, impassive. Engines hummed low. Emily took one last look at the cabin, at the life Ethan was leaving behind. "You don't have to come with us," she said. Ethan closed the door gently, the sound final but not bitter. "I know," he replied, "but I'm not done." They moved out in careful formation, tracks already disappearing behind them. In the distance the mountains waited, patient and cold. Beneath the snow, truths slept, unearthed at last, and no longer quiet. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, erasing distance and direction until the world became a narrow tunnel of white and motion. Ethan Miller moved with grim efficiency, his breath fogging the air as he secured the last strap on the sled hitched behind his snowmobile. The machine was old but reliable, its red paint scarred and dulled by years of hard winters. He had rebuilt the engine twice with his own hands, trusting it the way a man trusted a rifle he'd carried through too many bad nights. The sled behind it was small, improvised from a reinforced cargo frame layered with insulation pads and heavy blankets. At its center lay June, her body wrapped carefully, her injured leg braced and elevated. Her eyes were open, alert despite the sedatives the medic had administered, dark and intelligent, tracking Ethan as he worked. Ranger paced nearby, muscles taut beneath his thick sable coat, every step deliberate. The scar along his muzzle looked starker against the snow, lending him a hardened, almost mythic presence. He was 5 years old, Ethan estimated again, seasoned by work that demanded restraint as much as violence. Cole hovered close, thinner and lighter, his tan and black coat bristling with nervous energy. He was barely past too young for this kind of running fight, but too loyal to be left behind. Emily Carter stood a few yards away, radio pressed to her ear, shoulders squared against the wind. She looked smaller out here, swallowed by the storm and her heavy gear, but there was nothing fragile about her stance. Her parka was cinched tight, the hood pulled low, strands of blonde hair escaping only to freeze against her cheek. Her face had hardened again into that professional mask Ethan had come to recognize, focused, controlled, unyielding. She spoke into the radio in short, precise bursts, her voice calm even as static crackled back at her. "Visibility's dropping fast," she said, lowering the radio and turning toward Ethan. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before this turns into a full whiteout." "That's generous," Ethan replied. He swung onto the snowmobile, boots planted wide for balance. "If we're moving, we move now." Deputy Caleb Turner stood near his unmarked truck at the edge of the clearing, snow already piling against the tires. He looked older out here, the lines on his face deepened by cold and responsibility. His hazel eyes flicked from the forest to the sky, then back to Ethan. "If you lose sight of the trail markers, don't push it," he warned. "There's a frozen creek a mile out, low banks, some cover from the wind. If this storm closes in, that's your fallback." Ethan nodded. He didn't thank Turner. Men like them understood that warnings were a form of respect. Ranger stepped closer, placing his front paws briefly against the sled's edge, sniffing June, his ears flicking as if memorizing her scent again. June let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, and nudged his muzzle weakly. Cole whined under his breath, circling once before settling beside the sled, ready to move. They set off just as the wind surged, the snowmobile's engine growling into the void. The forest closed around them immediately, trees looming like dark pillars on either side. Emily followed on a second machine provided by Turner, keeping a careful distance so the sled wouldn't fishtail. She checked her radio every few seconds, jaw tight, eyes scanning for shadows that didn't belong to the storm. At first, the trail held. Red survey markers flickered past like dying embers, barely visible through the snow. Ethan leaned into the handlebars, body absorbing the machine's vibrations, instincts tuned to every change in pitch and resistance. He felt the terrain more than he saw it, the subtle dip of packed snow, the dangerous softness that hinted at buried ice. Then the wind shifted. It came hard and sudden, slamming into them from the side, tearing snow from the treetops and throwing it back in their faces. The markers vanished. The forest dissolved into a spinning wall of white. Ethan slowed instinctively, lifting one gloved hand to signal Emily to do the same. He glanced back at the sled. June was still secure, her chest rising and falling steadily. Ranger ran alongside for several strides, then leapt onto the sled's edge, bracing himself over her body, a living shield against the cold. Cole struggled to keep pace, his smaller frame battered by gusts, but he refused to fall back. "We're losing the trail," Emily's voice crackled through the radio, distorted by wind. "I know," Ethan replied. His voice was steady, but his jaw was set hard. He cut the engine briefly, listening not for sound, but for absence. The storm swallowed everything. No birds, no branches snapping, just the relentless roar of snow. 1 mile, frozen creek, low ground. He turned the snowmobile slightly east and restarted the engine. "Follow me," he said. "Stay close." They moved blind now, guided by memory and instinct rather than sight. Minutes stretched. Time lost meaning. The cold crept through layers, biting fingers and toes despite insulation. Cole stumbled once, tumbling into a drift, and Ethan stopped instantly, leaping off the machine. He hauled the young dog up, cradling his ribs briefly, checking for injury. Cole's tongue flicked out, licking Ethan's glove, eyes bright with apology more than pain. "Easy," Ethan muttered, setting him onto the sled behind Ranger. Cole resisted for a second, then collapsed beside June, pressed tight against her warmth. Ranger adjusted without protest, shifting to make space. The ground dipped sharply, almost too late to stop. Ethan swerved, heart slamming, and then they were down in it. Sheltered suddenly, the wind screaming overhead rather than through them. The frozen creek lay before them, a wide ribbon of ice dusted with snow, its banks low and curved, carved smooth by seasons of water and freeze. Emily pulled up beside him, breath coming hard. Snow clung to her lashes and eyebrows, turning her eyes into pale, fierce points of focus. "This is it," she said. "This has to be it." Ethan nodded. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt almost violent after the roar. The storm still raged above them, but here, in the creek bed, it was muted, distant. The dogs sensed it too. Ranger hopped down first, scanning the banks, posture easing just a fraction. Cole lifted his head, ears twitching, then settled again. June's breathing slowed, her body relaxing as if the land itself had offered permission to rest. They worked quickly. Ethan and Emily set up a temporary shelter using emergency tarps and collapsible poles from their packs, anchoring them with snow and ice. Ethan's hands moved automatically, muscle memory from long-forgotten drills guiding him. Emily assisted with efficient precision, her movements practiced, unhesitating. When the structure was up, they slid the sled beneath it, adding more insulation, blocking wind gaps with packed snow. As they worked, another figure emerged from the white at the far end of the creek bed. A man, hunched against the storm, moving carefully but without panic. He raised a hand slowly in greeting. "Hold," Ethan said quietly, rifle appearing in his hands without conscious thought. The man stopped immediately. He was in his mid-30s, average height, with a compact athletic build. His beard was short and dark, his hair hidden beneath a frost-rimmed cap. His face was wind-burned but open, eyes steady and alert. He wore a ranger's jacket marked with the emblem of Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. "Name's Daniel Price," he called, voice calm. "Search and rescue." Deputy Turner radioed ahead before the storm swallowed the signal. "Said you might come this way." Emily lowered her weapon first, relief flickering across her face. Ethan followed a beat later. Price approached slowly, respectful, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. He knelt near June, checking her vitals with gentle efficiency. "She's tough," he said softly, "but she needs warmth and time." "That we can give," Ethan replied. The storm howled above them, sealing the creek into a white cocoon. For now, escape had turned into endurance. Ethan sat back on his heels, exhaustion finally seeping in, and looked at the dogs huddled together beneath the tarp Ranger, vigilant even at rest. Cole curled tight against June breathing steady, alive. He realized then that this flight through the storm was no longer just about survival. It was about choice, about refusing to abandon the wounded, about moving forward even when the path vanished. Above them, the blizzard raged on. Beneath it, in the frozen creek, they held the line. Night settled over the frozen creek like a lid sealing heat inside a wound, and the storm reached a pitch that felt personal, as if the wind had learned their names and decided to call them out one by one. Snow poured down in relentless sheets, hammering the tarps, whispering against ice, erasing every edge until the world became sound and pressure alone. Beneath the shelter, the small circle of light cast by a hooded lantern trembled, revealing faces and fur in flickers, never holding still long enough to feel safe. Ethan Miller sat with his back against a packed snow wall, knees drawn up, rifle laid across his thighs, breath measured and slow. The old instincts had not left him. They had only been sleeping. Tonight they were awake, not in violence, but in watchfulness. Ranger lay closest to the open side of the shelter, body angled to intercept wind, shoulders squared, head lifted. The scar along his muzzle caught the lantern glow like a pale thread, a map of survival etched into flesh. He was not resting. He was standing guard the way soldiers did when sleep was optional and responsibility wasn't. Cole was tucked behind him, pressed tight to June's flank, his lean frame curled into a crescent that fit perfectly into the Space Ranger's vigilance created. Cole's youth showed in the way his paws twitched in dreams, the way his ears flicked at every new sound before settling again. June lay between them, wrapped in blankets, her breathing shallow but steady, her injured leg cushioned and still. Every so often, she lifted her head just enough to reach Ranger's shoulder, her tongue brushing his fur in a slow, deliberate motion that looked less like comfort and more like gratitude. Emily Carter watched them from across the shelter, her face softened by the dim light. She had shed the rigid posture she wore when danger was immediate, shoulders lowering as the night stretched on. The lines of fatigue deepened around her eyes, but something gentler lived there too now. Relief mixed with grief, the complicated aftermath of survival. She pulled her gloves off and flexed her fingers near the lantern, skin reddened and cracked, nails short and practical. Her movements were careful, quiet, as if she feared disturbing something sacred. "They rotate," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. "Even now, even like this." She nodded toward the dogs. Ranger takes the wind. Cole watches June. June checks Ranger. It's constant. Ethan followed her gaze, throat tightening. He had seen rotations like that before, under different skies, among men whose names he still carried like stones. He remembered nights when warmth was borrowed from proximity and courage was rationed in silence. The sight before him cut deep because it was so familiar and so undeserved. Animals carrying the weight of loyalty without being asked, without being promised anything in return. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They don't quit." The storm surged, slamming a gust into the tarp that made the poles groan. Snow cascaded down in a white curtain, briefly blotting out the lantern. Cole startled awake, lifting his head, eyes wide. Ranger did not move, but his muscles tightened, a living brace against the weather. June shifted, a soft sound escaping her throat, and Cole immediately nosed closer, pressing his chest against hers, warmth offered without question. June's tongue found his ear, a small anchoring touch, and Cole settled again, breath slowing. When Reyes trained them, he used to say loyalty wasn't obedience. He said obedience ends when the command ends. Loyalty stays. She smiled faintly, a fragile curve that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't understand what he meant until tonight." Ethan stared at the lantern flame, watching it bow and straighten with the wind. "Loyalty's expensive," he said. "Costs you sleep, costs you safety. Sometimes it costs you the chance to walk away." Emily glanced at him, studying the hard angles of his face. The broken nose, the beard shot through with gray, the eyes that had learned to keep their distance. "You walked away once," she said, not accusing. "From everything." He nodded. "I thought I did." The night deepened. Time lost its edges. Daniel Price checked in once, his silhouette passing briefly at the edge of the shelter, his calm presence reassuring, then gone again to monitor the creek banks. No new threats emerged. The storm itself was the adversary now, testing seams and stamina. Ethan rose to reinforce the windbreak with more packed snow, hands burning, breath steaming. He worked methodically, the way he always did, task by task, letting motion quiet the noise in his head. When he returned, he paused, struck still by what he saw. The dogs had shifted, subtly, deliberately. Ranger had lowered himself, finally, enough to rest his chin on his paws, but his body still blocked the wind. Cole had scooted closer to June, his back curved protectively, his breathing matched to hers. June had maneuvered, careful, pained, stubborn, until her head rested against Ranger's shoulder, her nose tucked into the warmth of his fur. They formed a single shape now, three bodies interlocked, a geometry of care perfected by necessity. Ethan felt his chest ache, not sharply, not all at once, but with a slow, spreading pressure that made breathing harder. He remembered the last night he'd spent with his unit before everything went wrong. The way they'd leaned together around a heater that barely worked, jokes whispered, promises unspoken. He remembered the morning after, the silence that followed, the emptiness that drove him into the woods where nothing asked him to remember. Emily saw the change in his face. She moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "They're showing you," she said softly, "what you already know." "What's that?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. "That staying is a choice," she replied, "and leaving doesn't always mean abandoning." Another gust slammed into the shelter, rattling the lantern hook. Ethan reached up, steadying it. The light stabilized. Outside the storm howled, but beneath the tarp something held. Hours passed. The cold sharpened, then eased, then sharpened again. Cole whimpered once in his sleep, a thin sound of remembered fear. June stirred, her breathing hitching. Ranger responded instantly, lifting his head, nudging her gently, his presence a promise. June's body relaxed. Cole quieted. Ranger did not move again. Emily's voice came barely above the wind. "They could have left her," she said, "when she went down. They didn't." Ethan shook his head. "They wouldn't. People would," Emily said. It wasn't bitterness. It was fact. Ethan looked at the dogs, then back at Emily. "Some don't," he said, "but you have to decide which kind you are." The storm began to lose its edge sometime near dawn. Not suddenly, not kindly, but with a gradual lessening, as if the night had spent what it came to spend. The wind dropped from a roar to a long, tired sigh. Snow still fell, but slower now, heavier flakes drifting instead of lashing. Daniel Price returned, kneeling to check June's temperature and circulation, his movements careful and precise. He nodded once, satisfied enough to offer hope without naming it. As the sky lightened to a pale, uncertain gray, Ethan sat watching the dogs breathe, the rise and fall of them steady and synchronized. He felt something loosen inside him, a knot he hadn't known how to untie. Loyalty, he realized, wasn't a thing you declared. It was something you did, over and over, when it would be easier not to. Emily watched him watch them. "You could still turn back," she said quietly, "when this is over." Ethan considered the frozen creek, the storm-softened forest, the three lives bound together by choice rather than command. He shook his head, slow and certain. "No," he said, "I don't think I could live with that." The lantern burned low. The dogs slept, but not deeply, never fully surrendering. Outside, the storm withdrew, leaving behind a world reshaped by white. Inside, beneath the shelter, loyalty kept its vigil, and a man who had spent years running from it finally stopped. Morning arrived clean and cold, the kind of light that makes every edge honest. The storm had retreated overnight, leaving the forest reshaped and quiet, branches bowed under fresh snow, the frozen creek smoothed into a pale ribbon that reflected the sky. Beneath the tarp, Ethan Miller stood still for a long moment, listening to the simple, fragile proof of survival. Breath, soft and steady, shared warmth, the faint scrape of boots approaching with purpose rather than threat. The support team came in low and careful, engines idling at a distance. First was a tracked utility vehicle, matte gray and scarred from years of winter work, followed by a medical snowcat with a red stripe dulled by frost. The men and women who stepped out wore layered gear marked with county and state insignia, their movements efficient, practiced. At their center walked Dr. Hannah Brooks, the veterinarian Daniel Price had radioed for before the storm swallowed the signal. She was in her early 40s, average height, compact and sturdy rather than delicate, with chestnut hair braided tightly down her back to keep it out of the way. Her skin was wind-reddened and freckled, her eyes a steady green that held calm like a promise. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone used to fear and pain, and knew how to meet both without flinching. Hannah crouched immediately beside June, her gloved hands gentle and precise, her voice low and reassuring. She spoke not only to Emily and Ethan, but to the dog herself, narrating each touch, each check, as if words could smooth the edges of sensation. June watched her with dark, intelligent eyes, then allowed her head to rest again when the assessment finished. "She's strong," Hannah said, "stronger than she should be after that night. We'll get her warm, get imaging done, and give that leg the rest it deserves." Ranger hovered close, posture alert but no longer rigid. He watched Hannah's hands, then her face, reading intention with the acuity of a veteran. Cole, still curled tight, lifted his head and sniffed the air, ears flicking at the unfamiliar scents of antiseptic and engine oil. Hannah noticed him and smiled faintly, a small concession to comfort. "You're the worrier," she murmured. Cole's tail thumped once, a quick, hopeful beat. Emily Carter stood a few steps back, shoulders easing as the process took over. The bruises on her face looked darker in daylight, the exhaustion deeper, but her eyes were clearer now. She had slept only in fragments, never fully surrendering to rest. Yet something like relief had found its way through the cracks. She spoke quietly with Daniel Price and Deputy Turner, reviewing transport plans, routes, contingencies. Turner nodded, taking notes with a pencil worn down to a stub, his weathered face set in lines of responsibility he did not pretend to enjoy. The transfer was careful and unhurried. June was secured into a padded crate designed for winter transport, heated and insulated, her injured leg braced. Ranger followed the crate without being asked, stopping only when Hannah placed a steady hand against his shoulder. "We'll keep her in sight," she said. "I promise." Ranger held her gaze for a long beat, then stepped back, obedience earned, not forced. Cole climbed in last, turning once to look at Ethan before settling beside June, pressing close, youth's faith undimmed. Ethan watched every step, hands loose at his sides, heart working harder than it had through gunfire or storm. He had known this moment was coming. He had rehearsed it in his mind through the long night, the separation, the silence after. Knowing did not make it easier. When the doors closed and the medical team moved away, the creek felt suddenly larger, emptier. Emily approached him, her breath fogging in the cold. "They'll be safe," she said, as much for him as for herself. "They'll recover. And when they're cleared, they'll go back to work, together." Ethan nodded, eyes fixed on the tracks already being swallowed by drifting snow. "They were never meant to stop," he said. "No," Emily agreed. She hesitated, then added, "Neither were you." The convoy prepared to leave. Hannah checked seals and gauges one last time, her movements brisk and sure. Daniel Price pulled his collar up against the wind and offered Ethan a nod of respect that required no reply. Turner shook Ethan's hand, his grip firm. "You did right," he said. "Not everyone does." Ethan watched the vehicles pull away, engines softening into the distance until they were nothing but memory and falling snow. The forest reclaimed its quiet, not hostile now, just wide and waiting. He stood there longer than he needed to, feeling the absence settle without hollowing him out. For the first time in years, the quiet did not feel like punishment. Emily lingered, hands tucked into her sleeves, gaze following the tracks until they vanished. Up close, she looked smaller without her gear, the lines of strain more visible, the resolve no less. "I'll be going too," she said. Statement, recovery, a lot of questions. She paused. "But not today." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "There's a safe ride waiting at the access road," she continued. "They can wait a bit longer." She looked at him, then at the forest, then back again. "I wanted to say thank you without radios or reports in the way." He considered her words, then nodded. "You don't owe me anything." She smiled, a real one this time, brief but warm. "I know. That's why it matters." They walked together a short distance, boots crunching softly, the sun climbing higher, warming nothing but spirits. At the edge of the creek bed, Emily stopped. "You opened your door," she said. "Most people don't." "Sometimes the door opens you." She held his gaze, understanding passing between them without ceremony. Then she turned and walked back toward the waiting vehicle, her figure shrinking against the white until it disappeared among the trees. Ethan returned alone to the shelter and began to pack. The tarp came down, the poles collapsed, the lantern was extinguished. He moved with the same care he always had, but something inside him had shifted, a weight redistributed rather than removed. When he reached the place where the dogs had slept, he paused, fingers brushing the snow where 3 bodies had once fit together as one. He did not linger. He did not need to. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had softened the sharpest edges of the world. He replaced the broken window, sealed the gaps, fed the fire. The space felt larger without the dogs, but not emptier. He set the kettle on and waited for it to sing. When it did, the sound filled the room and stayed. Later that afternoon, his radio crackled to life. Hannah's voice came through, steady and kind. "June's stable. Imaging looks good. Ranger didn't leave her side. Cole's already asleep." A pause. "They'll be ready to work again when the time comes." Ethan closed his eyes, a breath leaving him that he hadn't known he was holding. "Thank you," he said. When night came, it came gently. The forest settled into its rhythms, the stars pricking through the cold sky. Ethan sat by the fire and felt, for the first time in years, not fixed or finished, but open. He understood now that family was not defined by time or blood, but by what you chose to protect when the storm arrived. He had let go. In doing so, he had kept what mattered. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly on 4 tired legs in the middle of a storm, knocking on a door we almost didn't open. God doesn't always change the storm around us. Sometimes He changes the heart inside us by placing a soul in our path that needs love as much as we do. In our daily lives, we all face winters, lonely nights, heavy losses, moments when we feel forgotten. And yet, time and again, God sends signs through people, through animals, through unexpected moments of mercy, to remind us that we are never truly alone. If this story touched your heart, may it remind you to keep your door open, to compassion, to faith, to the quiet miracles God places right in front of us. Please share this story with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe in stories of love, loyalty, and second chances, consider subscribing to the channel. May God bless you, protect you, and bring warmth to your heart, even in the coldest seasons of life.